professor of occupational therapy at WashU, and I've been an occupational therapist for roughly 25 years or so. So I started my career in pediatrics, and as I gained some more experience, started to realize that a lot of my kids that I would see oftentimes had continuing issues on into adolescence and adulthood. And it became more of a passion of mine to really start thinking about how to help kids transition as they go through different life stages and experience new things, take on new responsibilities. Kids grow up, right? So a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today are relevant to thinking about kids of any age or youth of any age. But some of the examples I'm going to use are really specific to the experiences of late adolescence and early adulthood, because that's an area of experience of mine as well as my research. We good? Okay. But also I wanted to tell you that I am a parent too. I have 4 kids, and my oldest son, who will be 20 in June, it's hard to say, he is on the spectrum and also has ADHD and an anxiety disorder. And so some of the information I'm going to share today is really, stems from my passion to help him as he's navigated the world into adulthood. So how many of you are parents of kids in here? Great. And how many are practitioners? Cool. So I'll try to leave room at the end for questions, but I'm also a pretty casual presenter, so if you have a question, you can always interrupt me and raise your hand as we go. So two main priorities for today, and the first one is just to recognize contextual factors that make transitions difficult. And then the other one is just to have some real practical strategies that you can walk away with on just how to communicate and what goodness of fit really looks like, and I'll explain more about what I mean about goodness of fit environments. That's especially important at key transition stages. So when you're starting to take on new responsibilities and roles, being able to have some control over what you're doing, how you're doing it, and who you're doing it with is really an important part of that. So this is my picture of aliens embarking on their spaceship. And I wanted to put this picture up here because it's reminding me of a story that relates to my own experience with my own child. When my oldest son was about 13 years old, I don't remember what we were doing. We were hanging out in the house, and he asked me for a pair of scissors, which is really an odd request for him. He's not crafty, nor does he take the initiative to do his own homework without being told. So I'm like, scissors. This is very suspicious. So I just asked him, what do you want scissors for? And he told me that he was going to conduct an experiment, and he wanted to open up his arm to see if his blood was really red. And he told me that he thought his blood might be green because he felt like an alien. And I have to tell you, it was one of those moments where kind of time stops, and you have sort of this recognition that something wasn't going well, and he's trying to tell me about it. And so we spent a long time after that just talking about, what's going on with him and why he felt like his blood might be green. I did have to convince him that he did not need a pair of scissors to figure this out. And I reminded him of when he scraped his knee and how red blood came out, all the things. But what he was really trying to tell me is how separate he felt from everyone else. And so that really set me on a little detour in my career to try to figure out why that was, because it was information I hadn't really considered. Because he was actually doing pretty well at the time. He was getting good grades in school. He had a few people that I would call friends, but he felt very separate from them. So I don't know if that resonates with any of you as parents, but sometimes our kids say funny things, right? And it makes us think. So some of the things that we think about as far as just autistic traits. These are just a few of the ones that are common in the literature. But what I'm going to propose to you today is that what we consider a difference in autism might actually be just a regular, normal, typical human response to the way that we experience the world. In other words, if I drop you into a strange place where you don't really understand the customs or the language or where things are, and you're totally overwhelmed, maybe you also would become extremely rigid in your patterns. Maybe you would go to the same places over and over. Maybe you would eat the same safe foods. Maybe you would find the one or two familiar people who could help you navigate the new place, right? So all these things that we think of as like differences or traits that are separate from neurotypical thinking, in actuality make a lot of sense when you consider how someone else might be experiencing the world. Kind of like Russell was saying, you can have two people who have experienced the same thing and see it two very different ways. So when we think about especially transition to work, this really comes up a lot. I see it also in K through 12 education. I've spent a lot of time as a practitioner working in schools. But in school, it's a little bit different because there is such a focus on making sure kids are getting the services they need. And we talk about the IEP cliff. I'm sure parents are really familiar with that. And what we're really talking about is that shift that happens, right, when you're not entitled to the supports and services any longer. You're really eligible for them, which is quite different, right? You have to establish that you need them in order to receive them. And so oftentimes, things that we would think of as ways to, as educators, maybe meet children where they are, or meet youth where they are, or grade a lesson, or put accommodations and supports in. Those are things that, as an adult, we have to prepare our young adult children to self-advocate for, to understand what they need and how to communicate about it. And so the reason that this is important in a work situation is because we're missing out. We're missing out a lot on the real skill sets that people with autism and just neuroatypical people in general have in terms of being really great at what they do. We're missing out on that because they're not able necessarily to cope with the environment that they have to do it within. And so some of the things we're going to talk about are just related to these, seeing both and instead of one or the other, right? Sometimes this is true for all people, I think. Sometimes when you think about your own personal, strengths or challenges, there are things that you have struggles with, but that can also be a huge asset in other situations. So it is contextual. It is based in what's going on in the moment in the situation. So this is something we use a lot in occupational therapy as a framework to help us understand the relationship between a person and their environment and what it looks like when you're doing something, anything. Occupation really doesn't have to necessarily be about work. It can be about any of the things that you want or need to do in life that help you fulfill roles, right? So as you grow up and change, that is different depending on the stage of life you have, what you're doing. But in any given situation, we can think about what someone is doing and how they're doing it, and how that is really, whatever that looks like, is really an interaction between how a person comes into a given situation or environment. And environment doesn't necessarily mean always just the built environment. It also means the social environment, the unwritten rules, the schemas we have, so to speak, of how things work in the world that no one's really explaining. We just all sort of do them, right? But the person characteristics can also be things like, personal motivation, passion can fall into that. A sense of purpose can fall into that, in addition to skills or patterns of behavior. And what we figure out is that the greater alignment there is between a person and their unique gifts, skill sets, traits, and abilities and the environment, the more alignment that you have in those things, when they're working well together, the more people find a sense of belonging. It's an easier transition, and actually their rates of satisfaction will improve in terms of like their satisfaction with how their work situation's going, or whatever the new task is that they're taking on. So what's interesting about this is that it's not just about whether or not someone enjoys something or feels capable. It's also about their sense of competence, right? So how well you feel like you're doing has a lot to do with how comfortable you are in that specific environment. So what do we know from the literature? We definitely know that autistic young adults are much less likely to go to college, that graduation rates are lower than non-autistic peers in the general population, and other students with disabilities. And that's the real startling finding, really, is that this group that we collectively call autistic have poorer outcomes than many other disability groups when you're thinking about transition into young adulthood. Autistic people are dramatically underemployed, have a high rate of unemployment, more so than any other disability categories. People with degrees that are highly equipped to do a wide variety of jobs might not be able to hold down a job because of these contextual factors. Individuals with sensory differences report poor job satisfaction and greater levels of physical discomfort and increased anxiety when they're in those situations. But we also know that it's important to think about internal motivation as a predictor of well-being, satisfaction, and attitude for all people. So even though you might find that you are more uncomfortable in some environments or with some tasks, if you're passionate, if you have a sense of purpose, if you are motivated to do that work, it can help mitigate some of the effects of things like sensory overstimulation. Identified regulation is the best predictor of citizenship in a group or an organization, and that really has to do with what do I need, how do I need it, and is this group of people around me going to support me in doing that? And that's a lot of what Russell was talking about this morning, actually, in terms of inclusion. So I'm going to give you an example of what this looks like. So some of my doctoral research work was with an organization called Project Search. Some of you might be familiar with, but it's a national accredited program for transitioning young adults into work settings. The program can run either in like the senior year of high school or immediately after high school graduation as a post-secondary transition. And it's really done through a variety of funding streams. So in part, it's usually funded by education, voc rehab, and there's usually a host business that has agreed to provide work setting immersive training for the trainees. So what I'm going to show you now is an example of, I had a cohort of young adults on the spectrum who were just graduated from high school, who were learning new job skills. And this is an example of a stalker position. This is sort of like the basic job description. You can look at ONET for a more detailed job description, but it's fairly straightforward, right? When you read a job description, it's about skills, abilities, knowledge that you need in order to do that job. All job descriptions sort of have like those essential functions, right? So it's letting you know, these are the things you need to be successful in this type of work. These are two stocking positions that I worked with my trainees in. The one that you see on the left is a hospital acute floor central supply room. So in the hospital, there's a huge like storehouse full of all of the things that you need in a medical facility, everything from gauze, syringes, tubing, IV bags, all of it, right? And there are staff people in the hospital whose job it is to move things from the central warehouse to the individual floors where they're needed. It's a very tightly controlled, high level of structure. Everything is inventoried. Everything has a label and a space. and it's highly regulated. So they know exactly, there's a computer system that tells you exactly how many you should have on hand at any given time. And that's a way that they reduce waste in hospital settings. So here you can see my trainee is stocking one of the central supply rooms on the acute floor. The one on the right is another partner we had, TJ Maxx. This is the snack goods aisle. If you've ever been to TJ Maxx, you're familiar with the hunt, right? Not a lot of organization happening there. The shelves are usually overstocked. Sometimes you're afraid you're going to knock things off, right? The job descriptions for these two positions were nearly identical. Does this look like the same work? Just think about the context, right, of the work that you're doing and how you have to do it and what the expectation is in each of these environments. In the hospital and central supply, everything was a hierarchical, very straightforward structure. If there was ever a problem, there was a direct chain of command on how to work through that. But there were also challenges like having several storerooms to stock, and they each needed different things, and everything had a label and a code. And so there was a high level of organization that had to happen and coordination to get everything to the right place at the right time. There was also a lot of disruption. So at any given time, if there's an emergency on the floor, nurses come rushing into this area to get what they need to help support a patient, and that worker has to be able to quickly gather their things and move out of the way until the chaos is over. So it had its own challenges. At TJ Maxx, there's really nobody paying attention to what you put where until management shows up. And then the rules change. They change suddenly, and no one's going to tell you, hey, now we need to do it differently because somebody's coming to check. So my workers in this situation, I had two trainees that went through both of these rotations, and generally were highly successful in the hospital setting, even though there was a lot more intensity there, a lot more fast-paced, high level of task demand. They were more successful in that environment. They were labeled as inefficient at TJ Maxx for trying to organize the shelves or find labels or figure out where things go. So this is just one example of how, the job description doesn't really cut it. And if we stick with, thinking about ADA accessibility, right, as being based off of what are the essential functions for this role, what does somebody have to do, what are their skills and abilities, it limits us in thinking about what it's actually like to do the job, right? How does it actually work? Do I feel successful in it? And so that's a really important part. Typically, my trainees, they didn't have any difficulty learning the actual task. And Project Search is one of those programs that's really designed to place and train. So the focus is really on a sequential immersive training experience where you learn all the aspects of completing a job. My trainees could learn the job in less than a week usually. That wasn't the problem. It was navigating the social environment, figuring out what the expectations were, having different supervisors on different shifts, those kinds of things. So there's a social element to all these as well. So one of the things that I studied was related to thinking about self-determination theory as a way to think about what job success or what transition success in general looks like. And there are three psychological needs that are part of the guiding principles of this theory that talk about what someone needs to be effective and feel determined in what they're doing. And you've heard about, just from Russell's talk this morning, and I'm sure you've heard before about how important it is for somebody to feel independent, right? To feel like they're in control of their own situation a little bit. It can really increase anxiety when you feel like things are out of control, right? And so what does somebody need? And this is true, this is not just a theory that we apply to people with disabilities. This is kind of one of those things that, describes how a lot of people see self-determination. So basic needs include competence, feeling like you are capable of doing something. Autonomy, you have the ability to choose, to make choices, to have preferences, to be in control of yourself. And relatedness really has to do with belonging, feeling a sense of I can connect with other people who are here and that I'm working with or that I'm around all the time. And so these 3 pillars sort of formulated my thoughts around how do I want to support people through this transition, and what is it that I can do to really be helpful, like in a practical way. So the first one I want to talk about is relatedness. The first question that many of my trainees had is, do I belong here? Do I feel like I'm on the outside of this, or am I a part of what's going on? And there were some very simple things that I found made a huge difference for my young adults on the spectrum. One was having a designated place where their things went. And they could bring what they wanted to work. You know, it didn't have to make sense to anybody else. They didn't have to provide explanation for it, but they had a designated place that had their name on it where their things were going to go and other people's things weren't. So in departments where everybody sort of just like piled their stuff up on a back counter somewhere, it was a little less obvious that their things were welcome there too. And I found that my trainees were much more reluctant to bring things to work that would actually help them through their day when they didn't have a designated place for them to put them. That's such a simple thing, right? To give somebody a space and to put their name on it. It doesn't take a lot, right? But it's an invitation to be part, and especially if that place is with the collection of places that other coworkers also put their things. In other words, it's not separate or away from where everybody who works here puts their stuff, right? So like, I have a locker just like everyone else has a locker. That's really subtle, but it means a lot. Right? Now I am being seen as a coworker. I get ready for my day where everybody else does. This picture on the right is actually a bathroom door. So I had an issue with one of my trainees who was leaving his post where he was supposed to be working, traveling all the way down three floors to the main lobby to use the restroom. And he was getting marked off from his supervisor, and complaints were coming in from other people, the coworkers and others on the floor, that he was just abandoning his job. And I want to like be clear, like the words that they were using were really concerning, right? So like job abandonment, leaving his post, not doing his work, right? Eloping was one of the staff support words that we heard. Right? This door says staff only on it. I don't know if you can see it way back in the back, but this door says staff only, and that's the bathroom. Well, my trainee understood that he was there with Project Search, that he was not actually staff on the floor, that he was a student trainee. In his mind, this bathroom was not for him. So he was going down to the main lobby where the public restrooms were when he had to use the bathroom. Was he telling anybody he was doing this? No, because it didn't occur to him that he wasn't supposed to. This was a staff-only bathroom. Just taking the time to try to get to the bottom of that was the process that was really important. So instead of coming to that trainee and going, oh, you're abandoning your post, what's going on? I just simply asked the question, why are you leaving the floor? Tell me about what's going on. Why are you leaving the floor in the middle of work? Well, I had to use the bathroom. Okay. Why are you using this bathroom? Well, because this one says staff only. Oh, did you know that you can use the staff only bathroom? Because when you're here, you're considered staff. Oh, okay, thanks for letting me know. Problem solved. Sometimes it's just about making the ask. But it's really important to know the question to ask, right? To get curious. And that was the main thing that I did my entire time working with this program. Most of my interventions actually were not related to changing anything at all about the trainee. It was really about educating the people around the trainee to get curious, to not make assumptions, to really try to understand what's happening from that person's perspective. Don't you wish we all did that with each other every day? It's like a normal human thing, right? So one of the things that stood out to me about this was what the literature calls indexicality. And indexicality is really it's a language term that's used to describe meaning or inferential meaning about something. And I found that this came up a lot. Just the ability to interpret someone's words or behavior in the context of what would be expected for the situation. So in one example, one of my trainees was rushing down the hall with a cart trying to get his supplies up to the floors and brushed by a coworker and almost knocked her over coming through a door. And this didn't happen once. It probably happened, several times. Well, the coworker complained to the supervisor. And what it really came down to was she felt like he was doing it on purpose. It was, get out of my way. I've got this big cart. He wasn't saying hello. He wasn't smiling. He was very intently focused on getting his job done, being seen as capable of doing his job. He really enjoyed his job. He was on a mission to do it. It did not occur to him that it would be also important to wave to a coworker, to smile, to acknowledge them. And, he felt like he was in the right lane with his cart and that she should have moved over. Probably true. But the way that she interpreted his behavior was quite different. So what really made a big difference was in departments where it happened sort of organically. I didn't plan it. It wasn't something that even occurred to me as like an intervention strategy. But there would be, in some departments, people who had had previous experience with neuroatypical people who would act as almost like a cultural bridge. Oh, that's not what that meant. Oh, calm down. It had nothing to do with you. He's not angry. He was just in a hurry. Let's talk about it. And they would actually just sort of organically mediate that. And providing that like verbal perspective, just like verbally talking to somebody else about, well, maybe you're misinterpreting what that meant, and getting them to pause and just get curious about it made all the difference. I kind of refer those people as sort of like your early adopters, your cultural bridge people. They're people who might have a little bit more empathy just naturally. Maybe they've got prior experience, or maybe they're just more empathetic in general. Some people are just more socially attuned and can kind of tease through that a little bit better. But really recognizing multiple potential meanings of any behavior was really important. And it worked both ways, right? Sometimes our trainees would get frustrated because they weren't included in a meeting, not realizing that the meeting was only for mid-level managers. Or, there was kind of like this sense of paranoia a little bit about maybe they're talking about me, because it was coming from like sort of like an internal anxiety, like, am I doing a good job? Do I really belong here? And in actuality, none of those things were happening. So cultural mediation works both ways. But if you can identify the people who have a natural tendency towards that and leverage them as helpers in that new context, that can be really helpful. The other thing when we think about just competence in doing the job and autonomy too is really related to how we just experience the things that we're doing. This theory's been around a long time. It's by Mahai Csikszentmihalyi, and it's called flow theory. I don't know if any of you are familiar with flow, but flow is that thing that you do. We probably all have something that provides us some flow in life. But flow is that thing that you do when you're focused and happy and you're totally engaged in what you're doing. It's the thing that you do when you lose track of time. Anybody have a hobby like that? Like something you can do that you could just do it forever? Mine is gardening. I could literally lose half a day like out in my backyard and not even realize, like, my children are like, dinner was an hour ago, like, can we eat now? So, the things that you do that you're so wrapped up in that you find immensely pleasurable yet challenging, that require a lot of focus, but also provide you with a sense of satisfaction. You're focused and happy when you're doing them, and you can lose all sense of time while they're happening. People who spend more of their day consistently in a flow state, in flow activities, tend to be happier people overall. And people who experience flow at work, those lucky ducks, tend to have high job satisfaction and high quality of life. So many times we realize, some people are not motivated by money, right? Enjoying the work actually is one of the best ways to find goodness of fit, that overlap between a person and their environment. If somebody really enjoys what they're doing, they're going to rise to the occasion. They're going to develop their competency faster. They're going to make choices. They're going to advocate for themselves at work. They're going to feel a greater sense of belonging, most likely because they're going to be recognized for the work that they're doing, and they find it pleasurable. One of the things that made the hospital environment so inviting to so many of our trainees was that they could walk the floors and say hello to people. Loose social connections sometimes can increase flow, an experience of flow. You feel connected to other people, but it's within a very prescribed sort of scripted interaction, right? As I'm going through the hospital and I have my cart, people know I'm on the job. I'm not expected to stop and have a 20-minute conversation. I can greet all these people. I feel like they know me, I know them. One of my trainees really was good at mapping things. His private game with himself was to try to find a new way to get to his floor every day, to find the fastest elevator, to find the fastest route, to avoid construction, to avoid the place where the surgeons are going to be in and out of rooms. He would play a game to see. He timed himself. He timed the elevators. If you ever got lost in the hospital, he was the one person you absolutely wanted to find because he could tell you the best way to get anywhere. Autonomy support is something that we start working on pretty early, right? Making choices and things. We start working on that skill for, in early elementary. We even started, I think, in preschool when we're starting to talk about what do you like. Voicing preferences is really important, right? What's your favorite things, That's a way to build autonomy from the beginning, knowing what somebody likes, what they enjoy, what's important to them. But it goes even into adulthood. One of the things that I worked with sometimes with my trainees that really, I was trying to prepare them to self-advocate so that they wouldn't need an intermediary. And one of the things we talked about a lot is, how's this working for you? Is it working for you? What's your goal? How are you going to get there? What are the resources that you have available to you? And what are you going to do? And we would come up with a plan together. We would try out the plan like an experiment, and then we would come back together and say, okay, how did it work? What do we need to change? And just helping them kind of have a system for how to move through that was really beneficial. But I didn't stop there. I also gave this to the coworkers because I wanted them to have personal accountability for their interactions and their behavior as well. If they were having a conflict with one of our trainees, we developed strategies for them too. How can you pause, get curious, take a minute? Did it work? How is it going now? So we use the same strategy pretty much for everybody. We talk about relative mastery sometimes too in OT. Relative mastery is a little bit different in that it's perceived mastery. It's not actual mastery. So this doesn't really have anything to do with measuring someone's performance. This has to do with how effective do you feel and how efficient is it for you to do this thing. Relative mastery can be done on a scale, just like a pain scale or any other type of scale that you think of. It can be actually measured that way. But one of the reasons I like to use this was because when I did check-ins with my young adults, I wanted to not just understand how it was going. I wanted to understand how much effort was it taking. And this was a lot of times where I could uncover things like masking. My students who really were doing great, they were doing a great job at work. They seemed to be getting along with coworkers. They understood what was expected. They were dependable. They were developing all the professional skills. If I would do a check-in with them and their perceived efficiency was in the tank, right? It's taking everything I've got to do this. I go home and I just lay in my bed. Then I realized that we weren't where I wanted to be yet. We still had work to do. I wanted to make it less effortful. So this is just a way to kind of think about, and instead of just asking questions about what you can see on the outside, to have tools and strategies to ask about what's happening on the inside. How does it feel for you? How exhausting is this? What are you spending all your time thinking about? And oftentimes when we would get down to the root of that, we actually increased the trainee's ability to learn new skills or to take on new responsibilities because they had the bandwidth to concentrate on it. They weren't trying so hard to mask. So just building on those strengths is really important. Recognizing where the anxiety trigger points are, the sensory trigger points, asking specific questions about, do you feel like you belong here? And making it concrete. Like instead of just asking that question, saying, do you feel like you have a place to put your things? Do you feel like other people are nice to you when you're here? Are you having conflicts with people? And just really be interested in understanding where that's coming from. Giving opportunities for choice making. When do you want to take your break? How long does it need to be? What would work better for you? Just being curious about that. So that's all I have. I want to open it up for questions and any other comments or thoughts. And I'm also interested in things that you might have tried working with the individuals that you work with or your own children. So yeah, any questions? Mm-hmm. That's all right. So the question was, how does someone get into a work training program like Project Search? Project Search programs exist all over the country, and they are usually either embedded in a school system, like as a transition program post-high school, or they are, sometimes they're done through like the Department of Vocational Rehab in your state, or even sometimes like third-party agencies that treat adults and kids will have contracts to be a Project Search site. Project Search itself is a methodology for training people to enter productive work. And in order to be a Project Search site, you have to meet certain requirements. It's an accreditation process. So you can look at it, in your area and see if you have any Project Search locations. But they're usually by application and interview, there is a placement process. So it's not a great fit for every person, but it is a well-researched place and train program. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is a little beyond his son. He's just turned 11,
Mm-hmm.
and he's going to be going into middle school.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of trepidation about. Can you address that kind of a transition?
Yeah. So the question is, like, what about younger transitions? Like you say, your grandson's 11 and going into middle school. So some of the same things apply. Now, I will say this, not everybody is ready to have the level of self-awareness that it would take to really be able to voice what they need, especially if they haven't seen it before, right? So one of the most helpful things you can do for younger kids is to actually put them in the environment beforehand, like no stakes, right? So this is where extended orientation is really helpful, or just spending time in the physical built environment where they will be transitioning to. most of the time we do have a sense of what we need, but it's really hard when you don't know what to expect, right? And when you don't know what to expect, it actually lowers your threshold for tolerance when you're overstimulated. So even just think about like the last time you did anything new, right? You went a place that you haven't been before, or the first time you did something that required you to learn like a whole nother like way of doing things. I think about the first time that I flew by myself, which was when I was an adult, actually, and how frightened I was, like that I was going to miss my flight, finding the right terminal, knowing the expectations when you go through security. All that was new to me, and I had been kind of like a passive bystander when I did it as a younger person. So you can relate to that sense of like unknowing, right? And understand that you're like hyper vigilant in those situations. I think that's a really important thing to relate to and to try to answer any and all questions. So I think another thing that is important to think about is why the adults in this situation are feeling trepidation about that, and where does that come from? Because I think that's also something we don't always recognize as influencing how our kids feel. But if we don't find, if we kind of feel like it's going to be a struggle, they kind of sense that and feel that way too, and it sort of sets them up to experience it that way. So approaching it with like, maybe we all need to go to an orientation and see what this is going to feel like or be like is an important strategy too. I don't know. Everybody has their sort of personal preference as far as like what to disclose and to whom. But I always like meeting with teachers ahead of time and trying to just give space for my child to advocate for themselves. So having like a little one-on-one meeting, talking about likes and dislikes, just getting to know a person or two that are those familiar faces, the safe people, when you get into a new environment is great. You might find that there are some things about middle school that go tremendously better. I have one on the spectrum, but I have two more with social anxiety and one with severe ADHD. In fact, we make fun of my husband sometimes because he's the neuroatypical one, actually, in our family. But all my kids did better in middle school, and it was largely because, the classes are shorter. And if I'm having a hard time sitting still or paying attention, I'm going to get up and move anyway. I have a natural break every 50 to 90 minutes, and that was actually really helpful. So there might be, thinking of it as, there might be some things that are a struggle, but what are the things that are actually going to facilitate a better fit, knowing like who this little person is and how they like to move through the world. And just, setting up for success. Like, here are the people you can go to if something's not working out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yay, good. Yeah, I'm going to repeat what you said just so that it's captured on the video. But Brookfield Zoo, you said, has a project search. They're a project search site. They're a training site. That's wonderful. That's fun. Junior keeper. Love it.
And then my question for you is, would you suggest could you suggest any communication tools, AT, or other similar supports that folks could use for transition?
Yeah, so the question was, what communication, support tools are available out there? There are many different needs, right? So there's not really a one-size-fits-all. But one thing to think about is portability, especially if you're talking about somebody who's going to be, changing classrooms a lot, moving through a physical space a lot. You really want to make whatever the communication strategy is portable and accessible in all of those environments. We talked a lot today about signage and the importance of wayfinding, labeling, creating structure in the environment so that I don't have to actually ask every time I walk up to a new place, where is this, where does that go, and feel like, I'm the only person asking. That's a way to include people, is to make it so that they don't have to be the exception to the rule that has to have more questions answered. But it's also important to think about what is the communication from their end. If you need something for expressive communication, how can you make it portable but also make it not stand out in a crowd? A lot of people just want to look like everybody else. And this is one of those times where having a smartphone in your hand is super helpful because guess what? Everybody has a smartphone in their hand. What I find, though, is in environments where there are restrictions, and this is something that is kind of happening for the first time for us in Missouri. We just had a state law passed that's going to limit cell phone use in schools, and so it's kind of up in the air what that's going to look like. But that was always something that I tried to leverage as a strength because all the kids had access to phones, or it wasn't uncommon to find a kid using a smart device in a classroom. That's where we would put a lot of their communication devices, so apps are great for that. And then I don't have to walk around with a clunky device or a picture schedule or something that looks way different than what everyone else is using. Also, the platforms are becoming increasingly intuitive. So word prediction software is getting better and better. Voice dictation. I actually have master's and entry-level doctorate students who are using, real-time transcription services to process information. So that's a really widely accessible, universal strategy to use. But it becomes challenging when no one else is doing it because then we stick out. So you have to kind of manage that a little. Yeah.
Can you repeat what you said one more time? Real time.
Like real-time transcription. So if you think about I don't know if anybody's had a chance to play around with the AI assist on Zoom calls is a good example of this. Or when you're doing closed caption in real time using a platform, those are things that you can even use Google Voice to text on a phone in real time, or voice memo to record into words for somebody who is going to process information better visually as opposed to auditorily, or needs both in order to be able to process it. It's also helpful for supervisors and teachers not to have to repeat themselves. So if you're giving instructions and you want to record it so somebody can go back and look at it later, rather than having them come up and ask you, hey, I forgot what you said, I didn't get all that. That's a really, auditory processing is one of those things that we often find is something that we have to kind of problem solve around a little bit. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? I would like to hear more about what your thoughts are on ways to create belonging, or what you're using in your classrooms, because I find that that's one of the areas that I've spent the most time training other professionals on, or supervisors, or even people who are unfamiliar with disability. Even in situations where somebody's not employed yet, but especially in the interview process, or thinking about as somebody is transitioning into a new environment, do you have anything that you like to use? Or maybe it's something you hadn't thought about before. Yeah.
I'm going to talk from the perspective of work.
Mm-hmm.
It's very relevant to me. What has really worked for me, one, I'm embracing my autistic identity, so I told my boss, and my colleagues all know, so I'm not afraid of saying, hey, sorry, that was an autism moment.
Mm-hmm.
But what is awesome about my work environment compared to other ones I've been at is that when I tell my boss, ooh, I need captions for meetings, and he's like, I don't know how to do that. I'm like, let me do the back end, get it turned on so it's automatic for our Zoom meetings. And when I bring up an accommodation, he lets everybody in the organization, regardless of disability, do it. So he really believes in that universal design. And then it's something that sticks. I work remotely, so we offered it to everybody. You want to
Mm-hmm.
work remotely a certain percent of the time? Everyone's like, yeah, that's awesome. That makes our work life better. So I think even in the school setting, my son's teachers like that too. I'm like, hey, he needs this support. And he's like, cool, now everybody can stand up or do their homework or do their work on the floor or bounce on the ball. It's not just for the person with disability. And I think it really speaks to what you were saying about we don't want to stand out. And I think
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the comment was about thinking about how different strategies for increasing accessibility of work or just making communication streamlined can benefit everyone. And I think that is so true. A lot of the things that we talk about, even like when we were talking about, signage and labeling things, a lot of times, things like that are just things that we overlook. It's not that they're not necessary, but people learn over time, especially if you're in an environment every day. It's sort of like you've passed something 1,000 times and then you stop seeing it. The copier on the third floor is broken, and everyone knows that. Everyone knows it will only do one page, right? If everybody knows that and then a new person comes in and they don't know that, right? It's like, oh, I should probably tell you, right? Now imagine that magnified, right? Where it's everything. Like, this is our schema for where we eat lunch and how we talk to each other when we're at lunch. Here's what we consider appropriate behavior. Here's what's not. Here's how we greet people who are busy doing their own work without making them feel ignored. Imagine if literally all of those pieces of the daily social interactions, the hidden rules of how we all move through a space, needed explanation, right? Because they weren't obvious to me. When I, as a person coming into a new environment, have to navigate a new place, I'm not just navigating the place or the new expectations that are explicit for everyone. I'm also navigating all of the things that I have to do to relate to the other people in that environment and to do what I think other people expect. If I have a really hard time, though, understanding or knowing what someone else expects of me, then I need it to be explicit. And that's where strategies like social stories are helpful at younger ages. But guess what? We all have these. Like, anybody been on YouTube and seen like a day in the life, right? Or you're gonna go get a new degree and you're like, what's it like at this college campus? And lo and behold, there's a visual tour from a student who's gonna show you what it's like to move through. All of those things are the adult version of a social story. Here's what it's like to do this thing. Here's what it's like to be XYZ. And when you can see yourself doing those things, it does two things. It increases your sense of competence. You can envision being able to do that. You see it as a possibility to learn how to function in this way, do these different things. But it also helps you to know how to relate to the people who you're going to encounter there. And I think that is one of the things that is most important, is to just make as much of that obvious for everyone. And everybody benefits. There are times when we're all distracted. Does it help all of us to have access to closed caption? My kids watch movies with closed captioning on. Drives me bananas. I don't understand it. But that's a thing. Like, people, I can just process it better. I can keep up with the story better if I can see the words in addition to seeing the picture. Okay, great. That works for you. Those are the things that make it doable for everybody. So even though, it might be something that everybody just put up with, I find in general, like, having these kinds of conversations with teams, not just an individual person about what they need to do differently, but what an entire department is going to do differently, or how they need to set up the environment for everyone to be successful. Lo and behold, there are things that get talked about in those meetings. It's like, wow, yeah, this has been an inconvenience for me for over a year. Can we just solve it? And then everybody feels better about going to work or going to school. So I think that there's a lot of merit to just having deeper conversations about what are the sticking points for all people, and to normalize the reaction that people have when they're interpreting their surroundings differently as completely rational reactions to what's happening. I don't know if that helps or not, but yeah. Any other final thoughts? Questions? All right. Well, I'll be around for a few moments if you have any questions. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm trying to bring what I'm learning back to my school district.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote down project search. Is there any other resources, websites, books that you would recommend that I can bring back to my administration on this topic?
I think it's something. It's young adult transition either to work or to higher ed is something that I think is still it's not optimal. The systems are hard to weld together. Project Search is one example of a program that's trying to do that, trying to bridge gaps between secondary ed and moving people into the workforce. But there are many. Disability resources centers at universities, community colleges, and four-year universities are a great place to start. Having conversations with your team about the differences between education in a K through 12 level and how to prepare and equip students to be able to still get what they need in a different paradigm of being eligible but not entitled is really important. So self-advocacy. I think it's really important to start the transition process as soon as you can. A lot of schools will start that by law at age 16, some earlier, as early as 14. But having conversations about how to really start addressing, like, what are we getting ready for? And not just from an academic standpoint, but from, like, the just standpoint of, like, how's this person going to move through life and not have to go home and decompress their day? Like, what can we do all the way around to help this person be more successful as they move into whatever they want to do next? Having as much exposure to the possibilities, like immersing students in this is what it looks like to do this thing, helps give vision that can lead to better executive planning and goal setting later. There is funding for these kinds of programs through what's called Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Every state is mandated to spend at least 15% of their voc rehab budget on transition services for people with disabilities who are at risk for becoming disconnected after high school. And that is looking at how your state is spending those dollars. Every state has to have a plan in order to get that budget money. So looking at the programs that are in your state that are specific to addressing those needs is good, but it's usually a grant process. So schools can apply for those grants. Comprehensive transition programs at undergraduate universities are usually accessing those funds, things like that.
You said it was called workforce opportunity. Sorry.
The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act was passed during the Obama administration. And it's not just for people with disabilities, it's really to address all kinds of needs related to disconnection. Disconnection is actually a legal term that has to do with defining groups of people who become disconnected from community. So they're not volunteering, they're not going to school, they're not working a job. They are at home and they're not engaging or participating in the community. Because that has such extreme health consequences, we talked earlier about what isolation does for people and how that's a health risk of isolation. It's also a drain on economy, right? Because those are people who are not contributing and not paying taxes usually because they're not working. And so it was legislation with appropriation that was supposed to help innovate and develop programs to help all kinds of groups. Veterans is another group that there's provisions for in that act. So, but usually voc rehab is a big component of that. So working with your voc rehab departments is helpful too. Anybody else have any good resources? I'm definitely not an expert in everything, so. Okay. Yeah.
One of the ones in my area, if you go to like local SRA or
Mm-hmm.
Special Rec Association, a lot of times they have transition programs that are geared to doing all that prep, like learning how to use a bus, learning all those.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. So connecting with those agencies in your area that really work towards, training people on the other aspects, like how are you going to get to work? What were the ones that you mentioned? Sorry. SRAs, yeah. Hmm. Yes. So sometimes it's special rec programs. Sometimes those are programs that are run by your Health and Human Services or even your voc rehab departments. In my area, Goodwill Industries is a big one. But we even have like our public transportation program will train people how to use the bus who have never used it before and things like that. So you can definitely look into those resources as well. All right. Well, thanks for coming. Thanks for your attention. I hope it was helpful. I'll stick around for a few minutes if you have any questions.